Recent By Reason of Air Safety podcasts have addressed regulations and rules. I've referred to different aviation regulations from Title 14, Title 49, to qualify the topics discussed. It's been pretty dry stuff. Understanding the regulations, especially in aviation, keeps us aviation folks out of trouble. Regulations, also known as rules, help us to know when to recognize safety issues when we see them. Regulations don't only help keep us out of trouble with the FAA, they prevent clashes with each other, whether on a ramp or in a hangar. Regulations give us structure, boundaries, and order. In this podcast episode, we're going to take a look at how aviation regulations are being sabotaged by the ignorant in broad daylight with no concern for aviation safety. Why? Because members of the U.S. Congress and investigatory agencies don't understand the basic concept of consequences. Hello, I'm Stephen Carbone, and this is By Reason of Air Safety. Recent attention has been given to the Rotorcraft Operations Transparency and Oversight Reform Act, the Rotor Act. This is the latest attempt by the U.S. Congress to impose their brand of logic on an industry these congressmen and women can't possibly understand. Legislation, like their ridiculous acronym, Rotor Act, is raising concerns with many aviation professionals who only see a repeat of the myopic impression members of Congress have of aviation. These are justified fears. Why? Because the Rotor Act is the latest in a disturbing series of congressional bills and acts designed to circumvent established laws for rewriting aviation rules and regulations. The Rotor Act is one example of extreme government overreach by the federal government, specifically the U.S. Congress. The move by the U.S. Congress is supposedly aimed at benefiting public welfare. Instead, the Rotor Act will jeopardize aviation safety. How? Because members of Congress, whether their intentions are honorable or not, do not understand the consequences of their interference in the aviation regulations. Congress comes in, makes a bunch of useless changes, and then leaves the aviation industry and the FAA to clean up the mess. The Rotor Act has never received the proper scrutinization. What will it supposedly do for safety? How will it make us less safe? There is no member of Congress capable of answering these simple questions because no one in Congress is qualified. The Rotor Act was written to address issues with the January 29, 2025 accident between PSA Airlines Flight 5342 and a military Black Hawk helicopter. However, the Rotor Act was introduced the day before any evidence from the PSA Airline Black Hawk helicopter accident could be presented in the NTSB investigative hearing July 30th to August 1st, 2025. If this bipartisan legislation was authored before investigatory evidence could be given, where did the evidence to write the legislation come from, and who wrote the legislation? The Rotor Act, like any other legislation we will discuss in this episode, produces consequences. Perhaps the sponsors and voters of these safety-threatening bills and acts will be out of office or even have passed on before the effects of their legislation on the aviation industry will come to light, at which point the aviation industry will have to deal with the aftermath. But to be clear, the U.S. Congress's interference in the aviation industry has had and will have dire consequences on the industry. Why? Because the aviation industry never gets the opportunity to contest many of these bills and acts. To better understand what this podcast episode is all about, we need to clarify the difference between a law and a regulation. For purposes of clarity, definitions concerning laws and regulations in this podcast episode will be limited to those written and enforced by the federal government, specifically laws and regulations relating to the Federal Department of Transportation, the FAA, the NTSB, and their missions. The U.S. Code is law. According to Cornell University's website, laws are broad, mandatory statutes enacted by legislative bodies, like the legislative branch of the federal government, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. The U.S. Code is codified, meaning the process of compiling rules and laws into an orderly, formal code. A code can make the formulation of legal principles and rules more concise, clear, and thorough, so that people can understand the rules more quickly and comprehensively. In other words, they follow a logical pattern. But what do laws do? Well, laws provide an agency, such as the FAA, with authority. For example, the FAA oversees and regulates the aviation industry. The Congress authorizes the FAA to regulate and the NTSB to investigate. Now, these authorizations of the NTSB and FAA are not reversible. They prevent bias, such as the FAA does not investigate those certificates the FAA oversees, and the NTSB cannot regulate the transportation industry they investigate. Even though the NTSB can't regulate, that doesn't mean they don't try. Regulations, also called rules, are written by agencies, such as the FAA, to implement laws passed by the legislative branch. Regulations provide the technical how-to. Regulations are the means to execute the law. They are specialized, such as a regulation is changed or written by an agency because the agency knows how to implement the law. Before regulations are finalized, there are ample opportunities for public comment using the notices for proposed rulemaking, called the NPRMs, and the law defines what is allowed, while regulations are specific and detailed rules. If you understand these two simple concepts of what a regulation is and how it is changed, you already know more than anyone in the U.S. Congress or the NTSB. As for those in the U.S. Congress, there are those who truly don't understand how rules are changed, and then there are those who are selectively ignorant. In other words, they choose not to know. They're like that selfish antagonist in a Jurassic Park movie who unleashes chaos on the good guys before he gets eaten by a dinosaur. But seriously, rule changes can be life-altering and career-killing events. With just the movement of a comma or replacing an and with an or can alter a regulation far outside its original intent. A rule change can result in chaos and take years to correct. Title 14 is the regulatory home of aeronautics and space. To prevent confusion, we'll focus on Title 14, Chapter 1, Federal Aviation Administration, Department of Transportation. Changing regulations isn't a simple process. To begin with, many parties are part of the process depending on the complexity of the rule to be changed, such as legal, unions, budgeting, workgroup advisories, associations, air operators, repair stations, the FAA, and technical schools. According to 5 U.S. Code 553, paragraph B as in Baker, general notice of proposed rulemaking shall be published in the public register. The notice shall include 1. A statement of the time, place, and nature of the public ruling procedures. 2. Reference to legal authority. 3. Either terms or substance of the rulemaking. And 4. The Internet of address of summary. 5 U.S. Code 553 is a law. When rule writing is sidestepped, it's like politicians and bureaucrats are telling the aviation industry, We don't care what you think. Rule changes are a 5x5 event. It takes 5 years and $5 million to change the intent of one rule. The changes must be made available for public input and opposition. This is why, when Congress circumvents the rule-writing laws, the aviation industry suffers for years under the ignorance of the change. To be clear, laws bring about regulations. Regulations are used by agencies like the FAA to oversee their industry. Changing a rule isn't a minor undertaking. A rule change can affect a certificate holder's future plans, the certificate holder's location for conducting business, or can put a certificate holder out of business permanently. Furthermore, a rule change can unintentionally lead to disaster. For every rule change made to benefit a special interest or lobbyist, there are thousands of other lobbyists waiting to twist the ends to justify their means and their wallets. Rule changing has become an opportunity for people who scam to outwit naive congressmen. Unfortunately, it turns out deceiving members of the U.S. Congress isn't all that hard to do. On July 30, 2016, a sightseeing balloon struck power lines near Lockhart, Texas, killing the pilot and 15 passengers. This tragedy was NTSB accident number DCA 16MA204. The NTSB found the balloon pilot, who was not required to hold a medical certificate, was incapable of safely operating the balloon due to an uncorrectable medical condition. The balloonist's medical certificate was not required. Why? Because the regulation, Title 14 CFR Section 61.23, was rewritten and republished September 1st, 2004. A rule change made in ignorance led to an accident because of ignorance. But the NTSB didn't report this fact in the published accident report AAR-1703 for either of two reasons. Either one, the NTSB didn't want to research the regulation change, or two, the NTSB didn't know how to research the regulation change. This isn't a glib shot at the NTSB. To properly determine safety failures of any accident, the NTSB, as the federal investigatory agency, must know how to research accidents. The NTSB practice of smearing the FAA, like in note number 2 of accident report AAR 1703's probable cause, must stop. It's deceptive and unprofessional. The NTSB must learn how to determine factually why a regulation failed to maintain safety. That is the NTSB mandate, not to pile on blame without evidence. In 1997, the Experimental Aircraft Association, the EAA, lobbied to have that regulation, Title 14 CFR Section 61.23, changed. For what reason is unknown. But the rule change allowed balloon pilots, then called lighter-than-air pilots, to be exempt from medical certification. In other words, the EAA didn't consider the consequences of this action. The EAA did not think forward to how some irresponsible balloon pilot with a medical condition might just be unsafe. The EAA thought subjectively, not realistically. And the EAA moved to make the rule change because the EAA thought medical conditions the EAA considered harmless to be safe for a balloon pilot. However, they never considered that others with unsafe medical conditions would exploit the regulation change to their financial advantage. Section 61.23 had been changed for the EAA's personal benefit to favor the few with no regard for the pilot population, dismissing the consequences. The aftermath was catastrophic. The death toll was 16 souls. The fundamental error of regulation was changed with no regard to the consequences. On May 11, 1996, ValueJet Flight 592 crashed in the Florida Everglades shortly after taking off from Miami International Airport. The DC-9-32, registration number November 904 Victor Juliet, suffered a fire in the forward belly cargo compartment, Class D compartment, where the heat destroyed wiring and control cables. The airplane fell out of control because the fire started for two reasons. First reason was an unsecured tire fell. Two, the unsecured tire fell on hazardous materials misloaded in the forward belly compartment. The NTSB became obsessed with the term oxygen generators. The NTSB purposely ignored the correct term, hazardous materials. Because the NTSB failed to recognize the oxygen generators as hazardous materials, they failed to correctly comprehend how big this event was and how they totally missed the target. The NTSB ignored the facts. This led to millions of dollars wasted reconfiguring such airliners as the 707, DC-8, 727, 737, DC-9, MD-80, 717, A320, and the 757. In addition, the NTSB never tested to see if their recommendation would work before forcing their recommendations on the aviation industry. The NTSB exploited the emotional impact of the victims. The NTSB focused on an agenda to force the FAA to require fire suppression systems in Class D belly cargo compartments. The glaring mistake? Not all hazardous material reactions can be neutralized with a fire suppression system. The oxygen generators were considered a Class 4 hazardous material, a flammable solid. The changes never would have stopped the oxygen generator fire. And furthermore, other hazardous materials that produce fatal consequences if activated or breached cannot be stopped with fire suppression. For example, Class 1, explosives. Class 2, flammable gases like oxygens and acetylene. Class 3, flammable and combustible liquids. Class 4, flammable solids, spontaneously combustible and dangerous when wet materials. Class 5, oxidizers and organic peroxides. Class 6, poisons and poison inhalation hazards. And Class 8, corrosives. None of these hazardous materials would be sensed by smoke detectors nor neutralized by fire suppression. The modified cargo bays can do nothing to stop the chemical reactions. But the NTSB made the mistake of contradicting its own findings and recommendations by recognizing the hazardous materials, non-oxygen generators, were misloaded in the accident aircraft. In the AAR 9706 report, on page Roman numeral 10, X, the executive summary calls out the loading of hazardous materials on a no-carry aircraft. On page 29, the NTSB referenced the first officer's training on handling of hazardous materials. On pages 66 and 67, the NTSB referred to Chapter 8 of ValueJet's FAA-approved Station Operations Manual, stating they will not carry program as a hazardous program where hazardous materials are not allowed on ValueJet aircraft. Despite these findings, the NTSB continued to ignore the term hazardous materials in favor of the term oxygen generator. The bottom line, the root cause of this accident was that hazardous materials were loaded against ValueJet and FAA policies in a cargo compartment where hazardous materials were forbidden. The concept was so simple. Don't load hazardous materials where it's not allowed, and the flight will be safe. The NTSB ValueJet 592 Accident Report AAR 9706 and Federal Register 98-3838 contain unsubstantiated opinions and exaggerated allegations. The only ones who benefited from this were those who wrote the supplemental type certificates for modifications to thousands of airliner cargo bays. The airline industry lost millions from unnecessary modifications. Thousands of airliners were required to be outfitted with fire suppression systems that would never and will never do what the NTSB said it would. The biggest losers from this congressional mess were the small entities, some who went out of business, sold their aircraft, or were forced to modify at great cost. The NTSB, in a rush to forward an agenda, failed to recognize the consequences of an industry it didn't understand. The Aviation Technical Education Council, ATEC, forced regulatory change in the Title 14 CFR Part 147 rules, all the Part 147 rules. The safety consequences from this foolish and dangerous action will continue for years to come. How do I know? I teach FAA inspectors this class in the FAA Academy. I know what's coming. In 2007, organizations including ATEC took part in the Advisory and Rulemaking Committee, the ARAC, for Aviation Maintenance Technician Schools Curriculum and Operating Requirements to push Title 14 CFR Part 147 rule changes through the proper venue. Richard Fletcher and I discussed this in the By Reason of Air Safety episodes 11 and 12. The Allen study of September 1970, conducted by the University of California, was the benchmark for airframe and power plant technical schools requirements and expectations for students pursuing their aircraft technician certifications per Title 14 CFR Part 65 Subpart Delta and Part 147. The Allen study was the only confirmed and authorized research to clarify what students must know and the course hours required to complete their schooling. It was used for decades. The ARAC groups, including ATEC, were given ample time and opportunity to present data to the FAA on why Part 147 changes were necessary and how these would improve technical school quality. The FAA made it clear data was crucial for putting Part 147 through rewrite, more information than ATEC was willing to provide. During the 2007 Advisory and Rulemaking Committee, ATEC never produced the required data, and without it, the FAA couldn't justify rule rewrites, disturbing the aviation school's consistency and corrupting technician education quality. By failing to provide the data, the FAA concluded that ATEC demonstrated their ideas were outside the scope of safety, and the FAA's refusal was justified. However, instead of pushing to reconvene another committee and working to provide the required data, ATEC exploited the COVID shutdowns. The FAA was restricted by the administration at the time from reassembling another advisory and rulemaking committee, so ATEC pushed their agenda through using an unofficial path, the U.S. Congress. ATEC lobbied Oklahoma Senator Inhofe and other congressmen from both sides of the aisle, none of whom had any aviation technical school experience or knowledge. ATEC pushed these congressmen to bypass Law 5, U.S. Code 553. On December 27, 2020, ATEC, using these congressmen as unwitting actors, pushed Part 147 rule changes and buried the changes on pages 1175 of Public Law 116-260 in Section 135. The Part 147 regulations were rewritten without any industry feedback. The rewrite compromised FAA oversight and gave curriculum authority to colleges and universities without aviation experience or knowledge, giving authority to departments like liberal arts. The Part 147 rewrite also altered the way students were tested and how they qualified to test, changes that dealt a heavy blow to designees whose job it is to test students. Incidentally, these were changes the designees I just mentioned were prevented from even commenting on. ATEC justified its actions with misleading language, such as misquoting a 2003 Government Accountability Office GAO report. It's important to note the GAO's primary responsibility is to help Congress improve the performance and accountability of the federal government. However, the GAO is an auditing group. They have no experience in aviation. The GAO isn't involved in aviation regulatory matters. It doesn't have investigators equal to the FAA in aviation experience and knowledge. The bottom line is, ATEC never had aviation industry experience nor insight, and they deal with schools, period, not air operators or repair stations. ATEC is comprised of lawyers. ATEC doesn't deal in the aviation industry. ATEC was unqualified to rewrite Parts 65 and 147. Note, with the new Part 147 rules, graduating technicians aren't properly educated and have limited knowledge. Obtaining an FAA certificate has always been the first step. Everything the Part 147 students learn in a Part 147 school is important. Their education prepares the student to think, act, and be safe. Their education helps them to understand how to deal with hazards in the field. And their education gives the basic skills for which their careers will build on. This is what a Part 147 education does. Nothing more. The quality of Parts 65 and 147 education have fallen victim to a group of lawyers. And as can be seen with the old and new Part 147 regulations side by side, whether acting as a lobbyist or special interest, ATEC and their friends in the U.S. Congress have 1. Destroyed the safe environment technician students are educated in. 2. Eliminated accountability. 3. Provided the aviation industry with less qualified technicians. And 4. Set technician school education and training quality back decades. ATEC forced their way without doing their homework. They exploited a legal loophole and used clueless congressmen to pass it. ATEC changed the rules for an industry it doesn't understand. ATEC did this despite the consequences. Future Part 147 students will find it difficult to find good paying jobs because industry will not want to reteach technicians to the skills they should have learned in school. ATEC took no responsibility for their actions, and industry will suffer the consequences. Another example is frustratingly obvious. Title 14 regulations represent an agreement between all aviation entities and the FAA that Title 14 rules will be followed to ensure aviation safety. From procedural rules to certification, airmen, airspace, air traffic, air carriers, to schools, other certificated agencies, and airports, the FAA stands as the regulatory foundation for the aviation industry. Politicians are self-serving animals by their cause. New York Senators Schumer and Gillibrand lobbied for the Aviation Safety and FAA Extension Act of 2010. Their shameful misrepresentation of the families of the crash of Colgan 3407 coincidentally tied in with a push for votes with airport employees in New York by redirecting funds to these New York airports with the Aviation Safety and FAA Extension Act of 2010. Politicians will be politicians. Unfortunately, many Colgan 3407 NTSB report opinions didn't support the accident report's probable cause and never supported the accident's root causes. Schumer and Gillibrand forced changes that did nothing to prevent a similar accident. Schumer and Gillibrand mistakenly trusted the NTSB report AAR-1001, which ignored many facts in place of sensational opinions. AAR 1001 didn't identify problems in the regional airline system, and it didn't identify problems concerning regional pilot domicile limitations and airline responsibilities to their pilots. The U.S. Congress voted in useless Parts 121 and Part 135 pilot training issues, such as stall warning training, which was always in Part 121 and Part 135 10 or more pilot training programs before the FAA Extension Act of 2010. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, the U.S. Congress has been complicit in the scams of scammers. The U.S. Congress think they know more about aviation than those in aviation. Members of the U.S. Congress strut about with non-existent aviation skills and, like the emperor in his new clothes, preen for the media until someone says, "The congressman has nothing on." The U.S. Congress and the NTSB have been party to diverting attention away from what they don't understand, namely the aviation industry. Congress exploits ignorance to gin up emotions towards non-issues, especially during election years. There is nothing intuitive when they speak about aviation safety or aviation in general. Their actions will continue to bear consequences for their myopic actions. Meanwhile, the NTSB reports will continue to churn out nothing. No facts, no root causes, no quality recommendations. The NTSB and lobbyist actions will only give us inside the box thinking, while the industry will deal with the consequences of the NTSB's actions. Real safety will continue to get lost behind false safety. So what does the flying public face? Well, it looks like more accidents since we can't seem to find out what happened with the last ones. NTSB board members say they have them figured out, but the accident investigation reports and media interview circuses appear to be more resume fodder for board members than useful safety information. Maybe board members want to run for Congress. The bottom line is, whether there's a D, an R, or an I after your name, you're not qualified to change the federal aviation regulations. Your advisors telling you to change the rules, they need to come out of the dark and face some questions from qualified aviation professionals. And if you're a bureaucrat, you need to understand what your job is and your limitations. Your briefings are really confusing and nobody cares about your opinions on real events. Read the regulations under Title 49 and leave Title 14 alone. Wearing a jacket with the letters NTSB on the back does not qualify you to do anything but manage an agency's budget, not an accident investigation. And for those of you who think the Rotor Act will make aviation safer, not even close. Until next time, I am Stephen Carbone reminding you to tab. Think safe, act safe, be safe. God bless.